17 November, 1976. Falling. The moonlight was streaking through the windows like the world had forgotten it was the middle of the night, and Lavinia Selwyn was wandering the corridors. It was 3 a.m., and she knew if she was caught she'd be done for, but she couldn't quite bring herself to care. It had become a habit, an addiction almost, these late-night strolls through the corridors. She wanted to be moving on nights like this. She wanted to run, to feel the wind in her hair and the ground beneath her feet. She wanted her throat to burn and her legs to ache. Somehow, even after all this time, she still believed that if she ran fast enough, she could drive these thoughts from her head, like she could outrun her own brain. She sighed then, and she did not run. Being out this late in the corridors was bad enough. If she was out on the grounds, well, assuming she didn't get mauled by some strange creature from the forest, or murdered by the ghosts they said haunted the shrieking shack, the teachers would give her detention for the rest of her school years, which would be cut short, because her mother would kill her first. Lavinia gave a little sniff of laughter. Not that the thought was terribly amusing. It wasn't much of an exaggeration, if she was frank. Rhea Selwyn didn't tolerate rule-breaking. It brought shame to her family, and Rhea hated shame. A weight settled heavily on Lavinia at the thought of her mother. She stopped walking by a window and stood, looking out at the silver-lit grounds. The moon was just past full, and its light was bright enough to drown out much of her view of the stars. She wished it wasn't. She wished the moon was new and the stars were bright so she could look out at them and feel small, unimportant, nothing more than a blip on the cosmic radar, if that. She took a deep breath, the exhale shaky, and she pressed her hands to her face, blocking out the light. She needed sleep, but the thought of lying in bed, alone with her thoughts and surrounded by her friends, she stopped herself. They were hardly friends. Arranged acquaintances based on blood status was more like it. Not a single one of them had noticed Lavinia's late-night absences these past months. They hadn't noticed that her heart wasn't in it when she snapped back at the Marauders, probably because they didn't care. And why should they? Tears beaded in Lavinia's eyes, and she wiped them away, furious with herself, with her stupid, idiotic wish that someone, anyone, would notice that she was screaming inside. She was starting to show signs of it outside, too. But just like her lack of sleep, no one noticed or cared that she always wore long sleeves. No one noticed how carefully she held her hands these days, or saw her momentary wince when her bag slipped off her shoulder and hit the wrong places. She cursed the mask she always wore, cursed its necessity, and then she blessed it for teaching her how to hide, how to keep anyone from ever knowing. She was desperate, yes, and sure, she wanted someone to know and to care, in theory, but the reality of it would be hell, she knew. Who would help, anyway? Alexandra? Eloise? Severus? She almost laughed at the thought. They would turn around faster than she could blink and use it to disgrace her family and boost their own. Wiping her eyes again, Lavinia resolved to return to her dormitory. She had to at least try to sleep. If she was enough of a mess to be crying over whether or not Alexandra Foley cared about her, she must be desperate for rest. With any luck, she would be exhausted enough that she'd fall asleep quickly. So she began to make her way down the stairs. She was up on the 6th floor, which was ages away from her room down in the dungeons. She sighed at the thought of that many stairs. She really was exhausted. There was no two ways about it. She'd made it down 3 flights, switching paths every once in a while to accommodate the changing staircases, when she heard voices and nearly bit her tongue trying to keep herself from swearing aloud. She knew those voices, and they belonged to the absolute last people she wanted to run into right now. The Marauders. Picking up her pace, Lavinia hurried along, making it to the top of the next staircase before she heard one of those voices call out behind her. "Selwyn!" The voice cracked like a whip. For a moment, Lavinia considered just fleeing outright. But of course, if they'd already recognized her, Merlin, the rumors they'd start. So she did her best to pull herself together, hoping it was dark enough that they wouldn't notice her eyes, which were undoubtedly red from her crying earlier. With a deep breath, she set her shoulders and put her mask in place. "Black," she answered as she turned around, her voice cold and precise. She was somewhat surprised to find, when she faced them directly, that it wasn't the full group, just Black and Potter. Well, she thought, it hardly makes a difference. Black and Potter were the troublemakers in the group, after all. "What in the name of Merlin are you doing here?" asked Potter, the question stuck somewhere between accusation and curiosity. "I could ask you the same," Lavinia answered blithely. "Now, if you don't mind, I have better things to do than to talk to you two dimwits." She forced a smirk and turned to exit. Sweet Morgana, this was taking the energy right out of her. She didn't have the willpower to play this role right now, to be this girl her mother had honed, this girl she hated. Lavinia had almost completely turned around when Black called her again. Selwyn! What? She snapped, genuinely annoyed, pivoting only halfway this time, almost foolishly hoping they'd take the hint. That was a funny thought. The Marauders, taking a hint. If you were spying on us, Lavinia snorted. Spying on you? As if I want to listen to you talk more than I have to. Shockingly, Black, the world doesn't revolve around you. Then what the hell are you doing here? I'm trying to take the stairs. She kept her tone sweetly venomous, but she hardly felt it. She wanted to go to bed. She wanted to be in the dark, and she wanted to be alone. Mostly, she wanted to get away before her tired brain said anything stupid or out of character. Yeah, no shit, Black deadpanned. Why are you even out of bed? Lavinia felt her sarcastic smile slip for a second. Because the silence let me think, and my thoughts kept telling me to... She cut her own thoughts off, forcefully dragging herself back to the moment at hand, and pasting that smirk on her face like her life depended on it. That's hardly your concern, is it? She pointed out, but she could hear the lack of venom in the words. Black didn't miss it either. You're losing your touch, Selwyn, he said, a cold smirk on his face. Lavinia just stared at him, trying to remind herself to respond, to care. What, no witty comeback? Potter mocked, pitching in to help his best mate. The snake is speechless, Black added dramatically. Or maybe it's just stupid, Potter suggested. Lavinia, who had momentarily glazed over, staring at Black and trying to force her fuzzy brain to think of a good comeback, slipped her gaze back to Potter as her mother's last letter came ricocheting back into her head. When did you get so stupid, Lavinia? You're letting some half-crazy, scatterbrained Ravenclaw pass you in class. Your father and I are very disappointed. If you don't pull your marks back up by the end of the year, there will be consequences. Lavinia blinked, forcing her mother's voice out of her head, forcing herself not to remember what consequences meant. I'm not in the mood, Potter, she said softly. Go bother someone else. She turned away, leaving both boys standing in the moonlight, blinking in shock. Lavinia Selwyn never backed down from a challenge. James Potter simply shrugged and said loud enough for Lavinia to hear as she descended the stairs, Guess she's conceding our point, then. Sirius Black, however, didn't respond. He was too busy wondering what the hell had just happened. He and James had maintained a string of insulting banter with Lavinia Selwyn and her gang of Slytherins for 6 straight years, and she had never once let them have the last word. All the same, he brushed it aside. It was late. She was tired. What she had been doing up and wandering the castle at that hour was another question entirely, and certainly a much more interesting one, which he and James debated as they continued making their way back to Gryffindor Tower. Meanwhile, Lavinia padded softly down the remaining flights of stairs and slipped into the Slytherin common room, which was dark and haunting this late at night. Though beautiful during the day, with the sunshine tempered by the green and blue hues of the lake, at night the common room looked vaguely abandoned. It sometimes felt like a reflection of her own soul, dark and empty and haunted. No doubt why she avoided it and chose instead to wander the halls late at night. Stepping carefully across the room, avoiding the inert form of Regulus, who had fallen asleep on his Transfiguration homework again, and a pile of books someone had left by the door, Lavinia headed up the stairs to the girls' dormitory and entered silently. She slipped her shoes off beside her bed and hung her school robes from a corner of the bed frame. Then she slipped around the curtains on her 4-poster, careful not to move the rings on their rod lest they make noise as they slid along. With a sigh, she lay down and pulled the covers over her body. Sleep seemed to slip further away as soon as her head hit the pillow, and she stared up at the top canvas of her bed, listening to Alexandra's soft breathing and the occasional sniffing snore of Eloise, who had a cold. Lavinia rolled onto her side and put one arm gingerly beneath her pillow, wincing slightly as she put weight on her wrist. How had it come to this? What the hell had happened? Lavinia closed her eyes and remembered her first years at Hogwarts, remembered her sorting and her popularity and everything that had been right with her world. Remembered and tried desperately to figure out where the tipping point had been. Tried and failed. It hadn't been all at once, after all. It had been slow, gradual, like walking down a hill that got just a little bit steeper with every step. And the next thing she knew, the hill had turned into a cliff and she was falling with no one and nothing to catch her. She didn't know if she'd ever hit the bottom. She didn't know if there was a bottom. All she knew was that somewhere along the way, something had gone terribly wrong.